Everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Before I get into what should be a very hype second segment of today's show, I want to remind you to leave a tip and donation at the link gsmc.cloud. It is huge support to the network, me and my fellow podcasters, as always, so do consider that. We're going to stick with this one-person graphic right now to go into our second segment of today's show that I'm really excited about, continuing our fantasy college football rankings and finishing them off with the tight ends, the security blankets of the offense. Guys who are not going to be your main productions for your fantasy college football teams, but guys that you can constantly rely on to provide a certain number of points, maybe get you over the hump to win a couple more games than you were expecting. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Should be a very fun segment. Coming in at number 10 on this list is a guy from a team we've talked about a little bit on this show, Luke Haas of the Arkansas Razorbacks. Last year, he had 16 catches, 283 yards, 3 tight ends, a nice little season for a tight end. But as I was saying, looking at the Arkansas Razorbacks and looking at a quarterback in KJ Jefferson, who is in his 7th year of college football, highly experienced, knows what he's doing, I'm looking at the Arkansas Razorbacks to really have an interesting year where they're not necessarily competing in the SEC, but still being able to put up points. Obviously, they have a very experienced wide receiver core, so maybe a guy like Luke Haas loses that level of production, but with an experienced quarterback in KJ Jefferson, look for Luke Haas to be an interesting pickup that should win you a couple of games in your fantasy college football league. I'm really excited to see if KJ Jefferson and Luke Haas can still produce together, because this is KJ's last hurrah, and I really want him to be able to produce as well as this tight end Luke Haas. So I'm really excited for them. Coming in at the number 9 spot, a guy who transferred to Michigan State this past year in Jack Velling. He transfers in from Oregon State, moving with Aiden Childs, the backup QB last year for Oregon State, to Michigan State, what should be a very interesting team. Obviously, Aiden Childs was a former 5-star recruit, sat behind DJ Younglele last year at Oregon State, decided to move to Michigan State with his tight end, who last year had 29 catches for 438 yards and 8 TDs, so a very high-end production-wise tight end in Jack Velling right here. I think that Michigan State is going to be one of those teams who is still in this kind of stasis in the Big Ten. Obviously, with the addition of new teams from the West Coast, Michigan State is going to continue to fall further and further down the pecking order of the Big Ten. They really haven't been in the national spotlight for quite some time. However, Aiden Childs is an exciting, risky option for this Michigan State offense to rely upon. It is a crowded QB room over there at Michigan State, like I mentioned in prior episodes. So I'm really excited to see how Jack Velling and Aiden Childs, that partnership coming over from Oregon State, translate to a Michigan State team that wants to compete in the Big Ten, but really has to step up their game. So Jack Velling should be a very interesting pick production-wise in terms of fantasy college football. Coming in at number 8, we talked about his team a lot. Should be a very interesting tight end to look at. Jake Briningstool had 498 yards last year, 30 catches and 5 TDs for Clemson. Obviously, we're talking about Clemson as a team that's not going to be reliant on their passing attack as much due to the fact that they really don't know whether or not they can trust a guy like Cade Klubnik to lead this team. They really don't have that stability anymore at the QB position. But Jake Briningstool is a very interesting security blanket for them. For a wide receiver core who's really starting to try to grow into their own and help this young QB, and Bo Collins and Antonio Williams, but Jake Briningstool had a breakout year last year, 498 yards, not too shabby for a tight end last year, and a Clemson team that is still the cream of the crop in the ACC, but Florida State is going to catch up to them. Let's see how they transition. And Jake Briningstool is as good a bet as any at the tight end position in terms of fantasy college football, so I'm really excited for his year up ahead. Coming in at number 7, another guy on an SEC team that I'm really thrilled to see what they can do next year, and Caden Prieskorn at the number 7 spot. Obviously, we talked a lot about Ole Miss on this podcast. Obviously, what they bring to the table with Jackson Dart, one of the best QBs in the country, probably my second or third best QB in all of the SEC. And he has a guy in Caden Prieskorn who brings that experience. Obviously, they lost Quinshon Judkins to Ohio State, but they still have that receiving core that Jackson Dart can rely upon. And they bring in a guy in Henry Paris IV from Miami to kind of elevate that offense to one of the better offenses in the entirety of college football, in my opinion. But Caden Prieskorn last year had 449 yards on 30 catches for 4 TDs. Very reliable tight end. Looking forward to seeing how this Ole Miss team adapts to the new look SEC. So look out for Caden Prieskorn on your fantasy draft boards come draft time. Coming in at the number 6 spot, a guy with big shoes to fill, transferring into Georgia in Ben Urosek. I'm really intrigued to see how he plays out over at Georgia because, like I said, he has gigantic shoes to fill after they lose Brock Bowers to the NFL. We wish Brock Bowers the best of luck there. But coming into the season, Benjamin Urosek obviously wants to be a more high-profile tight end. Last year at Stanford, where he transferred from, he had only 16 catches for 239 yards and 1 TD. So we can see the potential there, moving into a system where Carson Beck really is very comfortable with distributing the ball to all his different weapons in a wide receiver core that's not as experienced as Georgia wide receiver groups of the past. Ben Urosek should have an interesting role. Obviously, they already had Oscar Delp in the squad, so it should be interesting to see what happens with 2 tight end sets, but look for Benjamin Urosek to have a big year, filling in for Brock Bowers in his gigantic production. So we'll see how Ben Urosek translates into a Georgia team looking to get back into the CFP. Getting into the top 5, a very, very feel-good story right here. One of my favorite college football tight ends from Utah. I promise he's the only Utah tight end on this list, but he's a fantastic fantasy option. Brant Kuithe. A fantastic story, like I said. Obviously, he missed the entirety of last year, along with his QB, Cam Rising. And now he wants to go out with a bang, walking off into the sunset with his fellow QB, Cam Rising, with a Big 12 championship. Moving from the Pac-12 to the Big 12 is Utah this year. Should be very exhilarating for them. But let's just talk about this. Brant Kuithe, when he's playing, he's one of the best tight ends in all of college football, like I said. In 2022, the last season he played, he had 19 catches, 206 yards, and 3 touchdowns. Now think about this. Both him and Rising missed last season. Obviously, very transitional year for Utah. They didn't really have that stability at the QB position that Cam Rising presents for them. So what a good story it would be, coming full circle, both of these players coming back, going out with a bang together if they win the Big 12 championship. They are one of the favorites now in the Big 12, so look for Brant Kuithe and Cam Rising to be one of the best QB tight end connections over there at Utah. Coming in at number 4, another school that produces so many tight ends in Iowa, and Luke Lachey. Obviously, Iowa, one of the great schools in terms of tight end production and transitioning to the NFL. We see it with George Kittle. We see it with Sam Laporta. We see it with so many different players. And Luke Lachey now is the top tight end right now for Iowa. Last year didn't have that big of a year. 10 catches, 131 yards, no touchdowns. But that was because he as well went down to injury. This year, he's going to really have to help this QB core, because right now Cade McNamara is out for spring practices with a torn ACL, and the only Quarterback is Marco Lainez, who's never played a snap of college football for Iowa at the very least. So Luke Lachey is going to have to be a guy who immediately needs to step up his production. So look for him to be a sleeper on fantasy draft boards. A lot of people may know about him due to the fact that it's Iowa and the tight ends they produce are so fantastic. But look for him as well to be that security blanket for whoever comes out of the Iowa QB situation. Coming in at number 3 is our first group of 5 kind of representative, and RJ Maryland of the SMU Mustangs. SMU is going to be one of the most exciting group of 5 teams in my opinion. They could look to break into the 12-team college football playoff. I would not be surprised. Behind the play of a guy in Preston Stone who came out of high school, the class of 2021, as a 5-star recruit, obviously picking SMU over other schools. Last year, he had 3,197 yards, 28 touchdowns, and 6 interceptions. So Preston Stone, look for him to connect with RJ Maryland a lot, who had 518 yards last year, the most of probably anyone on this list going forward, and 7 TDs off 34 catches. So I really like this SMU team, especially the fact that Preston Stone is now progressing, going into his senior year. I'm really excited to see what this connection brings. And look for RJ Maryland to be another one of those guys who's a fantasy steal for you just because of the yards he produces at the tight end spot. Coming in at number 2, our second group of 5 representative here on a much more low-key group of 5 team in Harold Fannin of Bowling Green. Now, Bowling Green is one of those teams that really is in like a weird stasis where they want to compete, but they're definitely not one of the prominent group of 5 programs that's going to be in the top 25 this year. They do have a guy who's been a very experienced QB in Connor Bazelak, journeyman kind of guy, but he's never really had a consistent season. However, that is not the case for his tight end, Harold Fannin. 623 receiving yards at the tight end position. Not too bad if I say so myself. 6 touchdowns, 44 catches. Look for him to be one of those guys that Connor Bazelak looks to a lot. He's not going to have that many yards at the QB position, Bazelak, but Harold Fannin is one of the best security blankets in the country, and he's not a high-profile name, so I can see him dropping in fantasy college football drafts. So I'm really thrilled to see how that shapes out for you guys come draft time. But coming in at the number 1 position, another interesting story with an intriguing storyline behind it. Oronde Gadsden of the Syracuse Orange. Now, Oronde Gadsden, like I said, has a miraculous story. He has literally played almost every position in this Syracuse offense over the past years, whether it be at slot receiver, outside receiver, and now we see him at the tight end position. But unfortunately, last year, much like Brant Keithy, his junior year was cut short by a Liz Frank injury, and he only had 7 catches for 67 yards last year. But coming into his senior year of college, he had a connection with Garrett Schrader that was one of the best in the country, one of the best receiving tight ends in college football. And now we have a guy transferring in Kyle McCord, kind of a shock transfer, who has the experience of throwing to a guy like Marvin Harrison Jr., another very versatile player. So look for that connection to be one of the best in the country. Look for Kyle McCord to not necessarily find his new Marvin Harrison Jr. in Gadsden, because Marvin Harrison Jr. is a generational tight end. Wide receiver rather. But Oronde Gadsden deserves number 1 because he's been doing it for so long, and I'm really interested to see how he translates with Kyle McCord and their connection as well. But that should just about do it for my top 10 rankings in terms of fantasy college football. It was really exciting to do these segments with you guys. But coming up next on the show, another sport is making its fantasy sports podcast debut. The beautiful game of football, not soccer, makes its much anticipated debut. We'll be looking at the Euros betting odds in terms of football coming up next on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast.
Looking for your daily